Story 1. The Aztec Chinampas, floating gardens of vegetables. Imagine yourself drifting slowly across a lake at dawn. The waters are calm, a still surface of reflective silver. In the distance, you see long, narrow plots of land, seemingly floating on the water. They are lined with willows and reeds, anchored into the shallow bed of the lake. These are Chinampas, the famed floating gardens of the Aztecs, though floating is not entirely accurate. They were man-made islands, constructed carefully by generations of hands, layered with mud, reeds, and vegetation until the water yielded land. To begin understanding these gardens, you must picture the Valley of Mexico in the 14th and 15th centuries. It was a high-altitude basin, surrounded by mountains, containing a series of interconnected lakes. The largest of these was Lake Texcoco, brackish and vast, bordered by smaller but more fertile freshwater lakes such as Xochimilco and Chalco. These lakes were shallow, but they were abundant with reeds, fish, waterfowl, and other resources that supported the people who lived along their shores. It was here that the Mexica people, later called the Aztecs, built their capital, Tenochtitlan, on a small island in Lake Texcoco. Yet the Aztecs faced a constant problem: how to feed a city that grew to hold hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. The surrounding land was limited, the soil was not always fertile, and as their population expanded, the pressure to produce more food increased dramatically. The solution was both practical and ingenious: the Chinampa. The construction of Chinampas. The word Chinampa comes from Nahuatl, the Aztec language, often translated as fence of reeds. The process of making one was slow, repetitive, and detail-oriented. Workers would first stake out a rectangle in the shallows of the lake, usually about 30 feet wide and 300 feet long. They drove wooden stakes into the lake bed to mark the edges. Between these posts, they wove reeds and branches, creating barriers like underwater fences. Next, they filled the enclosure with alternating layers of mud dredged from the lake bed, rotting vegetation, and lake sediment. The process was repeated over and over until the layers built up above the water's surface. Over time, the land became stable enough to support crops, houses, and even trees. To secure the Chinampa further, farmers often planted ahujote trees, a type of willow, along the edges. Their deep roots bound the soil, preventing erosion and holding the garden firmly in place. At first glance, these gardens appeared to float because of their shimmering reflections in the lake. In reality, they were firmly anchored. Over years, Chinampas became permanent features of the lake system, connected by canals that allowed canoes to pass between them. From above, the network looked like a green quilt stitched onto the waters, divided by ribbons of water used for transport and irrigation. The ecology of abundance. The genius of the Chinampa system lay not just in its construction, but in how it harmonized with the natural ecosystem. By dredging mud from the lake bottom, farmers brought nutrient-rich silt to the surface, constantly replenishing the soil. The canals ensured that water was never far from the roots of the plants, even during dry seasons. The system also regulated temperature, reducing frost damage, since the surrounding water absorbed heat during the day and released it at night. What did they grow here? The staples of the Aztec diet: maize, beans, squash, and chili peppers. Together, these crops formed the Mesoamerican triad, providing essential proteins, vitamins, and carbohydrates. Maize was ground into dough for tortillas and tamales. Beans offered protein and were often stewed. Squash provided both flesh and seeds. Chilies added flavor, spice, and preserved food through drying. Beyond these staples, Chinampas also supported tomatoes, amaranth, avocados, and herbs. Flowers, too, were cultivated, not only for decoration but also for use in rituals and markets. The Chinampas were astonishingly productive by some estimates. They could yield 7 crops per year, far surpassing the output of typical dryland farming. Life among the canals. To live among Chinampas was to live in a watery world. Families used canoes as their main form of transportation, gliding between gardens, markets, and neighborhoods. Children learned to paddle before they learned to walk steadily. Fishermen cast nets in the canals, while farmers tended their plots with digging sticks. Dogs barked from the banks. Women ground maize on stone slabs, their rhythmic work echoing across the water. Smoke curled from hearth fires where tamales steamed. In the early morning, the air was filled with the sound of birds, the herons, ducks, and egrets that nested in the reeds. By midday, the hum of work dominated. The splash of oars, the call of vendors moving goods, the distant chant of priests from the temples of Tenochtitlan. At night, the Chinampas rested under starlight, the canals reflecting the constellations that guided Aztec calendars and rituals. For the Aztecs, this was not merely farming, it was survival engineered through balance with water. And yet, there is a deeper question. How did such a fragile, water-bound system endure wars, floods, and droughts? How did these carefully crafted islands support an empire that demanded tribute from distant lands, and armies that marched across mountains? The floating gardens of the Valley of Mexico, though humble in appearance, became one of the greatest agricultural feats in the pre-Columbian world. The Chinampa system, with its layered mud, rotting vegetation, and precise hydrology, was not merely a method of food production, it was the foundation upon which the Aztec Empire was built. To understand this transformation from a local innovation to an imperial engine, you must look at Tenochtitlan, the capital city that rose from a marshy island and became a bustling metropolis of stone causeways, pyramids, markets, and canals. At its peak, the city may have held over 200,000 people, rivaling or surpassing the population of major European cities like London or Paris at the time. Feeding an empire from water. This population density was made possible in large part due to Chinampas. Each plot could feed multiple families, and the cumulative effect of thousands of Chinampas was staggering. Fields were harvested several times per year, and the soil, constantly replenished by Lake Muck, remained fertile for decades, even centuries. Other Mesoamerican civilizations had impressive irrigation systems, but none created this level of high-intensity agriculture in such proximity to a major urban center. The lakes of Xochimilco and Chalco, to the south of Tenochtitlan, became central zones of food production. These were the Chinampa heartlands, protected and administered by the state, and even today, fragments of them survive still in cultivation after over 700 years. The Aztec state bureaucracy recognized the strategic value of Chinampas. Tribute records from the Codex Mendoza reveal that many regions within the empire were forced to send food, textiles, and other goods to Tenochtitlan. But within the basin of Mexico, Chinampas allowed the Aztecs to become self-reliant in staple crops. This freed up their tribute system to demand luxuries: cacao, jade, feathers, obsidian, while their basic nutritional needs were met domestically. This self-sufficiency gave the Aztecs a resilient economic base, one that supported professional warriors, artisans, priests, and scribes. The food grown on Chinampas fueled not only stomachs but an entire social hierarchy. Governance and the garden. The success of the Chinampa system required more than clever farming. It demanded organization. The Aztecs developed land tenure systems where Chinampas could be held by families, clans, called calpuli, or allocated by the state. Nobles often managed large areas of Chinampas and employed laborers or tenant farmers to work them. In return, these nobles contributed to the upkeep of the state, funding temples, feeding warriors, and supporting infrastructure projects. Canals needed regular dredging, boundaries needed remarking, and water levels had to be managed carefully, especially during floods or dry seasons. The Aztecs developed dikes and sluices, including the famous Nezahualcóyotl dike, a 16-kilometer-long structure that separated brackish Lake Texcoco from the freshwater southern lakes. The Chinampa zones themselves were often organized into neighborhoods or farming wards, where local leaders managed both agricultural planning and religious rituals. Because in the Aztec world, farming was sacred. Each planting season began with offerings to Tlaloc, the rain god, and Chicamecotl, the maize goddess. Children were sometimes sacrificed in these rituals, their tears seen as symbols of the rains to come. Every harvest was marked by ceremonies, dances, and feasting. Farmers did not merely grow food, they maintained cosmic balance. The Chinampa was a spiritual space as well as a physical one. War and the waterways. As the Aztecs expanded their empire through military conquest, Chinampas continued to play a central role not in battle, but in supply and logistics. Aztec armies could travel long distances, but their power radiated outward from Tenochtitlan, and supply chains had to be maintained. While tribute goods came from afar, the daily staples for the soldiers, workers, and priests of the capital were grown in the surrounding waters. During wartime, Chinampa farmers might be drafted into temporary military service, but the state often made provisions to keep food production going. In fact, many conquered peoples were settled in Chinampa zones, especially if they had skills in farming, irrigation, or canal maintenance. This process was part of a broader policy of controlled resettlement, a common imperial strategy in Mesoamerica. The canals also allowed for rapid movement of goods and people. Canoes, often carved from a single tree trunk, glided smoothly between garden plots. Larger canoes carried baskets of maize, cages of turkeys, bundles of firewood, and even construction materials like stone and adobe. Markets in Tenochtitlan teemed with produce from the Chinampas, all delivered fresh via these watery roads. It's hard to overstate how much mobility and trade defined Aztec urban life. While European cities choked on horse traffic and muddy roads, the Aztecs enjoyed a canoe-based transportation system that was elegant, efficient, and quiet. Problems beneath the surface. Still, the Chinampa system was not without its vulnerabilities. Though remarkably resilient, the gardens were always at risk from changing water levels, political conflict, and overuse. The Aztecs had to constantly dredge the canals and remove invasive plants. Flooding could wipe out entire crops. In particularly dry years, the water table dropped, and Chinampas could dry out, cracking like pottery in the sun. The rapid expansion of Tenochtitlan also placed enormous pressure on nearby ecosystems. Deforestation, needed for firewood and construction, destabilized nearby hills and contributed to soil erosion. As with all great cities, prosperity brought imbalance. Politically, the ownership of Chinampas became increasingly unequal. As noble families accumulated land, smallholders were pushed to the margins. Some commoners lost their plots and became tenant farmers, laboring for wealthier landlords. The very system that once represented communal ingenuity began to mirror the stratification of empire. Even so, Chinampas endured. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1519, they were astonished by what they saw. The eyes of the conquistadors. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a Spanish soldier who accompanied Hernán Cortés, wrote with wonder about Tenochtitlan. In his memoirs, he described the city's canals, markets, temples, and floating gardens in vivid detail. He and his fellow Spaniards were unprepared for the sophistication of Aztec infrastructure. They compared the city to Venice and the Chinampas to floating fields. But unlike Venice, these gardens produced vast amounts of food. To the Spaniards, who were more familiar with open-field farming and feudal estates, the idea of cultivating crops on engineered islands was nothing short of miraculous. Yet even as they marveled, the Spaniards would soon bring destruction. An uncertain future. By the early 16th century, Chinampas were woven into the very fabric of Aztec life culturally, economically, and spiritually. They provided not only sustenance but also a shared identity, a way of living with water, of tamming it without draining it, of building land instead of conquering it. But conquest loomed. With the arrival of the Spanish and the diseases they brought, the world of the Chinampa farmers would face profound and irreversible change. How would these delicate islands, constructed over generations with reeds and mud, survive the fire and iron of colonial war? Could a system built on harmony with the environment endure the extractive machinery of empire? It was 1521, and the city of Tenochtitlan, once described as the Venice of the New World, was burning. After months of siege, starvation, and bloodshed, Spanish forces under Hernán Cortés, aided by thousands of indigenous allies, brought the mighty city to its knees. The causeways were broken, the temples desecrated. The population, once hundreds of thousands strong, was decimated by disease, famine, and war. In the midst of this collapse, the fate of the Chinampas, the intricate, life-giving floating gardens, hung in uncertainty. Would these carefully layered beds of mud and reeds, created over generations, be swept away with the empire they fed? Or could a system so deeply embedded in the landscape outlast the empire that had refined it? The conquest and collapse. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire was not merely a military event, it was an ecological disaster. The siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521 caused the deliberate destruction of aqueducts, dikes, and canal infrastructure. Cortés ordered the flooding of parts of the city to prevent the Aztecs from regrouping. The delicate balance of freshwater and saltwater in Lake Texcoco collapsed. Many Chinampa zones were inundated or dried up entirely, depending on their location. The survivors of the conquest were left in ruins. Indigenous farmers were stripped of land, enslaved or reduced to serfdom. The tribute system that once moved goods across vast distances was replaced with colonial land grants and encomiendas that disrupted local economies and knowledge systems. And yet the Chinampas did not disappear. They endured not because of colonial policy or Spanish admiration, but because local farmers, mostly Nahua people, continued to tend them, often in secret, often in silence, relying on inherited knowledge passed down orally and ritually. These farmers, many of them women and elders, continued to dredge the canals, plant the ahujote trees, and weave reeds along the edges of the plots. They grew the same crops: maize, beans, squash, chilies now consumed by Spanish soldiers and Catholic friars, but raised using ancient methods. A system too good to erase. The Spanish, despite their desire to impose European agricultural techniques, could not ignore the productivity of the Chinampa system. Over time, some colonial officials came to understand the value of these floating gardens, even if they misunderstood how they worked. The Spanish began to tax the produce grown in Chinampa regions, particularly around Xochimilco and Chalco, which remained some of the most fertile zones in central Mexico. While large estates, haciendas, began to take hold in drier regions, the Chinampa lands proved resistant to European-style division. Their thin, narrow layout and water-bound design made them hard to partition or plow. Moreover, indigenous communities fought legal battles in colonial courts using Spanish law to retain access to their Chinampa lands. Dozens of documents from the 16th and 17th centuries detail petitions, lawsuits, and testimonies from Nahua farmers defending their right to grow on Chinampa plots. And in many cases, they succeeded. The quiet persistence of water agriculture. By the 18th century, the landscape of the Valley of Mexico had changed drastically. The Spanish had embarked on an aggressive campaign to drain Lake Texcoco, fearing floods in the growing colonial capital of Mexico City. The lake levels dropped, and the once interconnected lake system was fragmented. But in the southern lakes of Xochimilco and Chalco, Chinampas continued to thrive. These regions, farther from the colonial core, were still predominantly indigenous. Farmers developed new techniques, sometimes combining Spanish-introduced tools and animals such as oxen and metal implements with the traditional Chinampa system. They grew European crops like lettuce, spinach, carrots, and onions alongside maize and amaranth. Flowers, marigolds, dahlias, roses became important cash crops, especially for colonial festivals. Xochimilco, in particular, gained a reputation for its flower boats that brought brilliant colors into the markets of Mexico City. While most European visitors saw these gardens as curiosities, some botanists and geographers began to take notice. In the 19th century, Alexander von Humboldt, the famed Prussian naturalist, visited the Valley of Mexico and described the Chinampa system with admiration. He noted the ecological wisdom of recycling organic matter, maintaining moisture through canals, and working in harmony with the environment. Still, even his praise could not prevent the slow encroachment of urbanization. The modern struggle, a dying system. By the 20th century, the city of Mexico had exploded in size. The ancient lakes were now nearly gone drained for flood control and urban expansion. Highways, apartment blocks, and industrial zones crept ever closer to the Chinampa fields. Pollution in the canals increased. The water, once drawn from springs and artesian wells, became stagnant or contaminated. Many Chinampa farmers were forced to abandon their plots. Younger generations moved to the city, looking for work. Farming, once sacred, became economically marginal. Still, Xochimilco held on. In 1987, the UNESCO World Heritage Site designation was awarded to the Historic Center of Mexico City and Xochimilco, in part due to the survival of the Chinampa system. This recognition brought global attention, but not necessarily resources. By the early 2000s, only a fraction of the original Chinampa area remained in active use. Environmental degradation, invasive species, and real estate development continued to threaten the system. Yet, a new wave of hope emerged from an unexpected direction. A return to the roots. In recent years, a growing movement of ecologists, agronomists, and indigenous activists have sought to revive the Chinampa system as a model of sustainable agriculture. Organizations now work to clean and restore the canals, reintroduce native vegetation, promote organic farming, educate urban youth about traditional techniques. Urban farms in Mexico City have taken inspiration from Chinampas. Some local restaurants now source ingredients directly from Chinampa farmers. The demand for fresh, organic produce has given new relevance to these ancient gardens. There are also educational initiatives run by local indigenous leaders that teach Nahuatl, traditional farming songs, and the spiritual meanings of planting cycles. Chinampas, once nearly lost, are being remembered not just as relics, but as living systems with lessons for a planet in ecological crisis. Scholars and farmers alike are now asking, what can we learn from a society that built its survival on mud, roots, and water rather than steel, oil, and concrete? Reflections on a Forgotten Engine. The story of the Chinampas is not dramatic in the way history books often tell stories. There are no epic battles on these fields, no kings crowned, no speeches etched into stone. Instead, there are generations of hands, layering mud upon mud, pruning willows, dredging silt, and whispering to the maize stalks. There is a quiet dignity in this form of survival, the kind that speaks to the resilience of culture when empires fall, the kind that reveals how small acts, planting, harvesting, repairing a canal, can carry entire civilizations. The Chinampas were not just floating gardens. They were an idea that human beings could live with water, not against it, that land need not be conquered, only made with patience. And perhaps the final question is this: in a world of rising seas and vanishing soils, are we finally ready to learn from the gardeners of the lake? Story 2: Roman aqueducts, stones that carried water for centuries. You may not notice them now, quiet ruins of arches that stretch across the European countryside, half-sunken conduits of stone and mortar. But in their time, they were wonders of civil engineering, created not for glory, but for function. These were the aqueducts of Rome, the arteries that carried life itself, water to a thirsty and growing empire. Though they are not temples or triumphal arches, the aqueducts tell a story just as vital. They are the story of survival, of public health, of quiet, persistent infrastructure. They are the bones beneath the skin of empire, holding together a society of millions with a steady, unremarkable flow of water. A city without water. Rome, before the aqueducts, was not the grand marble capital of the known world. It was a hilltop settlement beside the muddy Tiber River, a river that was unreliable, silty, and often foul. The people of early Rome relied on local springs and shallow wells, drawing water by hand, sharing public basins, and carrying jars to and from their homes. As the population grew into the tens of thousands during the Republic, the city began to experience chronic water shortages, especially during the hot summer months. Wells dried up. Cisterns grew stagnant. Diseases, though not understood in microbial terms, were observed to spread with foul water. Even bathing, a central cultural habit of later Rome, was difficult without a reliable supply. The Romans looked to nature and engineering for a solution. The first aqueduct, Aqua Appia, 312 BCE. In the early 4th century BCE, a Roman censor named Appius Claudius Caecus proposed a radical idea: to channel clean water from a distant spring into the city via an underground conduit. This first aqueduct, the Aqua Appia, brought water from springs approximately 16 kilometers away. It was entirely underground, both to protect it from enemy sabotage and to maintain pressure and cleanliness. Water moved by gravity alone, descending gradually toward the city in a meticulously measured decline, less than a foot of slope for every 100 feet of length. This required precision, persistence, and thousands of man-hours. Crews of engineers, surveyors, grammatici, slaves, and laborers dug trenches, lined channels with stone and waterproof mortar, opus signinum, and maintained constant slope with the use of a tool called the corybates, a kind of spirit level with plumb lines. The success of Aqua Appia was transformative. Suddenly, clean, abundant water flowed into the heart of Rome, supplying fountains, public baths, and even private homes of the elite. But it was only the beginning. Over the next 5 centuries, Rome would construct 11 major aqueducts, stretching hundreds of kilometers and supplying more than 1 million cubic meters of water per day at the height of the empire. Building with gravity. Roman aqueducts worked not by pumps or pressure, but by one ancient, universal force: gravity. Each aqueduct began at a source, a spring, a river, or a catchment basin in the hills. From there, water entered a conduit, a long, gently sloping tunnel made of stone, concrete, or clay pipe, sometimes covered, sometimes open. Over valleys and lowlands, aqueducts would rise on arcades of arches, some towering over 90 feet tall. Across rivers, engineers built inverted siphons using lead or stone pipes. Through hills, they cut tunnels and shafts. The goal was always the same: a consistent, gentle drop in elevation that allowed water to flow without stopping or backing up. The margin of error was tiny. A slope too steep would erode the channel, too shallow, and water would stagnate. And so Roman engineers measured, adjusted, and built with obsessive precision, often conducting test channels before final construction. The hidden layers of water infrastructure. While the aqueducts are remembered for their picturesque arches stretching across landscapes like the Pont du Gard in Gaul, or the Aqua Claudia, near Rome, most of the system was invisible. In fact, more than 80% of Roman aqueducts ran underground. These subterranean channels were safer, easier to maintain, and less expensive to build. Covered by slabs or vaulted ceilings, they avoided evaporation and pollution. Vertical access shafts were spaced along the route for cleaning and inspection. The conduits were lined with waterproof mortar, and the bottom often developed a thick calcium carbonate layer, which helped protect the structure, though it eventually needed to be scraped clean, a job performed by workers known as aquarii. Maintenance was essential. Aqueducts required constant vigilance against blockage, leakage, sediment buildup, and sabotage. The Romans developed a specialized corps, the curators aquarum, or water overseers, who supervised teams of technicians, masons, divers, and slaves, all devoted to the care of the water system. Where the water went. Once the water reached Rome, it entered massive casella distribution tanks, often elevated, where the flow could be split into multiple pipelines. From there, water traveled to public fountains lacus, for general access, particularly for the poor. Bathhouses thermae, large complexes with hot, warm, and cold pools, requiring vast quantities of water. Private homes reserved for the elite, who paid for connections and maintenance. Irrigation and industry, including mills, dye works, and tanneries. One of the most remarkable features of the Roman system was its redundancy. Multiple aqueducts supplied overlapping regions, so if one failed or was under repair, others could take up the slack. The result: a city where citizens had access to water year-round, in public and private life, for drinking, washing, cooking, and leisure. It is estimated that, at its peak, Rome had more water per capita than modern London. And yet, despite this success, the system had its critics even in ancient times. Water, wealth, and inequality. The philosopher Seneca, writing in the 1st century CE, complained about the excesses of the wealthy who diverted aqueducts to feed their ornamental pools and fountains, while commoners waited in line at public basins. The poet Juvenal mocked landlords who charged extra rent for apartments with piped water. Indeed, though public baths and fountains were available, access was not equal. The water system reflected and reinforced the social stratification of Roman society. To obtain a private water connection, one needed approval from the emperor, and the fees were substantial. Corruption was common. Unauthorized taps were frequent, and inspectors were often bribed to look the other way. And so, the aqueducts became not just physical infrastructure, but symbols of Roman order and inequality, tools of control as much as utility. Still, to most Romans, the system was nothing short of miraculous. To drink clean water, to bathe daily, to walk streets washed by flowing streams, these were hallmarks of Roman civilization. But could such an intricate system survive the collapse of the empire that built it? If you stood at the edge of a provincial Roman town, be it in Gaul, Syria, or North Africa, you might spot the unmistakable curve of an aqueduct arch in the distance. To see one was to know that Rome had been there. These structures, with their precise measurements and characteristic arcades, were imperial fingerprints, symbols of power and order etched across the landscape. But these were not identical copies of Rome's waterworks. Across the empire, Roman aqueducts took on regional character, adapted to geography, materials, climate, and local politics. They served cities big and small, often transforming rural settlements into thriving urban centers by doing what Rome had done first: bringing water where there was none. The Roman aqueduct system wasn't just a capital city marvel, it was an imperial blueprint, scaled and repeated across the vast reaches of Roman influence. Beyond the city of Rome. By the early 1st century CE, nearly every major Roman city had at least one aqueduct. Some had several. In Lugdunum, modern Lyon, France, the Romans constructed 4 aqueducts, one of which included a siphon system to cross a deep valley using lead pipes and stone pressure towers. Carthage in North Africa boasted a 132-kilometer aqueduct that included bridges, tunnels, and elevated channels still partially standing today. In Segovia, Spain, the Aqueducto Romano towers above the town, a multi-tiered marvel of cut granite with no mortar at all, its arches framing the streets centuries later. Even in Roman Britain, in towns like Caerleon or Aquae-Sulis, modern Bath, aqueducts delivered water to bathhouses and forums despite the wetter, cooler climate. Each aqueduct system began with a careful survey, performed by military engineers or local specialists trained in Roman techniques. They identified a reliable source often far from the town and began planning the optimal route. This was rarely a straight line. Instead, Roman aqueducts wound through hills, skirted valleys, tunneled through rock, and rose across marshes on arcades. The priority was always the same: preserve a gradual, continuous gradient, often no more than 1 meter drop per kilometer. In many ways, the expansion of aqueducts represented not just engineering ambition, but Roman cultural imposition. Where water flowed, Roman habits followed: bathing, hygiene, public fountains, latrines, and social order. Aqueducts and provincial life. In the provinces, aqueducts altered the rhythms of daily life. In cities like Nimes, home to the famous Pont du Gard, aqueducts allowed for lavish public baths and fountains that became centers of civic pride. Elite families sponsored portions of the construction or maintenance, their names carved into dedication stones. Markets thrived near fountains. Bakers, launderers, and artisans all benefited from predictable, clean water. The laundry industry, in particular, relied on aqueducts to feed fulling vats, where cloth was cleaned using fermented urine, a Roman method both practical and pungent. Even urban planning was reshaped. Streets were laid out to accommodate drainage channels, runoff from fountains, and access points for inspection. Civic engineers, often of the equestrian class, managed water distribution and reported directly to the curator's aquarum, who maintained detailed logs of water usage and flow rates. And with water came sanitation. Public latrines, flushed by aqueduct water, replaced primitive pits. Sewers like the Cloaca Maxima in Rome channeled waste away from population centers. Though hardly modern, Roman sanitation greatly reduced stagnation and visible filth. In dry climates, aqueducts also allowed for irrigation of public gardens, military training fields, and ceremonial spaces. In the arid fringes of the Empire, Judea, Numidia, and parts of Syria, aqueducts made city life sustainable. But not all aqueducts were successful. Obstacles and failures. The expansion of aqueducts across the empire was not without challenges. Some projects never reached completion due to cost, corruption, or local resistance. In Palmyra, for instance, efforts to expand water infrastructure were constrained by terrain and politics. In Dacia, modern Romania, where the terrain was mountainous and hostile, construction was slow and vulnerable to raids. In other regions, aqueducts suffered from neglect, especially after the decline of Central Roman authority. Sediment clogging, earthquakes, and theft of building materials led many provincial aqueducts to fall into disrepair within a few centuries of their construction. Local populations, unfamiliar with Roman hydraulic engineering, often repurposed or dismantled aqueducts for their stone and metal components. Some lead piping was melted down for weapons or trade. Others viewed the aqueducts as symbols of a fallen empire, useful but not sacred. Still, many remained. Their ruins became landmarks, their stones embedded in medieval churches, castles, and walls. In some regions, portions of Roman aqueducts were even incorporated into later water systems, serving monasteries, estates, and early industrial sites. The people who maintained the flow. Behind every aqueduct was an invisible workforce. Surveyors and designers planned the route, adjusting slope and correcting for terrain. Stonecutters carved channels and arches, sometimes inscribing unit marks to track their labor. Slaves and conscripted workers mixed mortar, cleared brush, and carried materials. Maintenance crews, called aquarii, regularly inspected tunnels, cleared mineral buildup, and repaired leaks. In many towns, a local curator aquarum, an appointed official, maintained records and responded to disputes over water rights. Fines were imposed for illegal taps, blocked channels, or pollution of the source. Water law was codified in imperial edicts, some of which survive today in stone inscriptions and legal texts. One such document, the Lex Quinctia, is a 1st century BCE law that outlines penalties for damaging waterworks, including fines, property confiscation, and even corporal punishment. It reflects how seriously water was taken in Roman life. Aqueducts weren't just structures. They were part of a living legal and administrative system, dependent on constant oversight and communal responsibility. Religion and water. In Roman thought, water had spiritual significance, and aqueducts were often associated with purity, health, and the divine. Springs were sometimes dedicated to nymphs or local deities. Shrines might be erected at the aqueduct's source. Offerings were made for successful construction. Fountains and baths bore inscriptions to the emperor or the gods, blending civic gratitude with spiritual reverence. In some cities, the arrival of water was marked with ceremonial celebrations, and the opening of a new aqueduct could be cause for a public feast or parade. For Rome, water was not only useful, it was a symbol of order, and order was sacred. What happens when water stops? The decline of the Roman Empire slow, regionally uneven, and complex affected aqueducts in different ways. In Western Europe, as imperial funding vanished, aqueducts fell out of use. By the 6th century CE, many were in ruins. Germanic kings sometimes maintained sections, but most lacked the administrative machinery to repair large-scale systems. Water returned to wells, rain catchers, and manual hauling. In the Eastern Roman, Byzantine Empire, however, some aqueducts continued in use for centuries. Constantinople had an extensive aqueduct system, including the Valens Aqueduct, which supplied the city well into the Middle Ages. The fall of aqueducts marked not just the loss of water but the loss of a certain kind of urban life, hygienic, civic-minded, regulated. As fountains dried up, streets grew dirtier, disease more rampant, and public life more constrained. Still, the memory of Roman water engineering would linger. In the Renaissance, scholars and architects rediscovered the writings of Vitruvius, a Roman engineer who had described the principles of aqueduct design. His texts inspired the early modern revival of water systems, and in places like Nimes, Segovia, and Rome, the surviving aqueducts became symbols of past greatness. But as the modern world moved toward pumps, steel, and electric power, the question remained: was there still something to learn from the gravity-bound, quietly flowing water systems of Rome? The aqueducts, once alive with rushing water, are now mostly silent. Some stand tall, their arches still cutting across blue skies. Others lie buried, fragmented beneath layers of soil, city, and time. But though the water has long ceased to flow in most, their memory flows still in architecture, in engineering, and in the way we conceive of infrastructure as something more than pipes and pumps. To walk beside a Roman aqueduct today is to walk alongside a history that is not grand in its declarations, but persistent in its function. These were not monuments to power or conquest, but to continuity. And though many now see them as ruins, they were once the very veins of civilization. When the flow slowed to trickle. By the late 5th century CE, Rome was no longer the imperial capital of the Western world. The pressures of war, economic instability, internal decay, and external invasions weakened the administrative structure that kept the aqueducts functioning. Without trained curators, skilled equarii, and state-sponsored maintenance, many of the great aqueducts of the Western Empire began to fail. One after another, they dried up. Aqua Claudia, once feeding the Palatine Hill and imperial baths, fell into disrepair. Aqua Marcia, long admired for its clarity, became clogged and partially collapsed. Aqua Virgo, remarkably, continued to operate in reduced form and would be revived later during the Renaissance. The fall of the aqueducts didn't happen with a bang, it was more like a slow seep. Some were intentionally destroyed by invading forces, like the Goths, who severed aqueducts to besiege cities. Others were simply neglected. In place of fountains and flowing baths, the people of Rome and its provinces returned to older, more primitive methods, digging wells, using rainwater cisterns, or hauling water in buckets. With the loss of centralized water came the loss of public hygiene and the daily social rituals that bathing had fostered. Disease followed. Urban life, once made bearable by reliable water, became more difficult. The standard of living declined not with the drama of battle, but with the quiet decay of infrastructure. And yet the aqueducts remained. Stones for new worlds. As centuries passed, the aqueducts became part of the urban and rural landscape, absorbed by time. In the Middle Ages, locals quarried aqueduct stone to build churches, castles, and walls. Some arches were used as stables or granaries, others as parts of monastic complexes. In rural areas, aqueducts became shelters for shepherds, markers of property lines, or simply backdrops for grazing livestock. Yet in some places, the channels themselves were still used. In the hills of Naples, portions of ancient aqueducts fed early Christian catacombs. In Tunis, Thamugati, and other sites in North Africa, fragments of Roman water infrastructure were reused well into the Islamic Golden Age. Perhaps most remarkably, in Rome itself, several aqueducts were revived or repurposed. Renaissance revival. During the Renaissance, humanist scholars rediscovered the writings of Vitruvius and Frontinus, the latter a Roman official who had written an entire treatise, De Aqueductu, on aqueduct administration in the 1st century CE. Inspired by these texts, and by the visible remains of aqueducts still rising in their cities, Renaissance engineers sought to restore water to a parched and overcrowded Rome. In 1453, Pope Nicholas V ordered the restoration of Aqua Virgo, which once again delivered water to the Trevi district. This would eventually lead to the construction of the Trevi Fountain, still fed in part by this ancient aqueduct. Later popes commissioned the restoration or imitation of other aqueducts. Aqua Fellis, completed in the late 16th century, was a new aqueduct that followed ancient paths to supply clean water to the growing city. These projects were not mere nostalgia, they were acts of survival, of returning to a proven system. The Romans, Renaissance thinkers realized, had solved problems of sanitation and water distribution that their own societies were still struggling with. Engineering lessons that echo. Even today, modern civil engineers study Roman aqueducts. Their longevity, simplicity, and sustainability offer insights into how infrastructure can be durable, low energy, and low maintenance. Some lessons include gravity-based systems that require no external power, self-cleaning gradients that prevent sediment buildup, accessible inspection shafts for regular maintenance, use of local materials and workforce, public infrastructure as a shared civic responsibility, not a privatized service. In an age of failing water systems and decaying pipes, the Roman model has begun to inspire ecological and historical studies of infrastructure that doesn't just function but lasts. The aqueducts remind us that infrastructure can be beautiful, embedded in the landscape, and treated with reverence. It can serve the public not for decades, but for centuries. Stones with memory. There is something haunting about a Roman aqueduct. Its arches, whether standing alone in a wheat field or hidden behind modern buildings, hold a kind of architectural memory. They whisper of a time when water moved in silence, unpressurized but unrelenting, flowing through hills, valleys, and cities, drawn only by the logic of slope and the discipline of stone. Unlike monuments to emperors or generals, aqueducts were built to serve, not to boast. They represent an engineering ideal that is quiet, enduring, and communal. You do not see a Roman aqueduct and think of war. You think of work, measurement, and the necessity of water. You think of people, thousands of them, digging, lifting, aligning stones, and smoothing mortar under a Mediterranean sun. And you might wonder, what would it mean if we built our cities not for glory, but for usefulness? Not for victory, but for endurance? The final reflection. Today, we live in a world where water infrastructure is often hidden beneath asphalt, behind walls, invisible until it breaks. But the Romans made their aqueducts visible and proud because they understood something vital, that a city's greatness rests not in its monuments, but in the systems that quietly sustain life. The aqueducts were those systems. They carried water, and in doing so, they carried civilization, not with haste but with gravity. And perhaps even now, as we build taller towers and faster networks, we might pause to remember. How do you build something that still works after 2,000 years? Story 3. Medieval Guilds. The rules of bakers, weavers, and tanners. Close your eyes and imagine a medieval street at dawn. The cobblestones are slick with dew, and the air smells of ash, yeast, and livestock. There is no silence, not truly. You hear the thud of wooden doors opening, the low murmur of voices, the clink of iron tools, and the faint ringing of bells in the distance. Behind these sounds, something is unfolding, not warfare, not royalty, not religion, but labor. This is the story of the medieval guilds: bakers, weavers, tanners, coopers, smiths, and cobblers, those who shaped Europe not with swords or sermons, but with skill. Their stories are not often told in detail, but they built the fabric of daily life quite literally. Their quiet authority governed not only production but morals, quality, and community in ways that still echo today. Though we often reduce guilds to simple trade unions or craft associations, they were something more layered: economic systems, regulatory bodies, social support networks, and guardians of tradition. They controlled not just what could be made, but who could make it, how, when, and for how much. The guild as a body. The term guild comes from the Old English gilden, meaning to pay, a nod to the membership dues that structured these organizations. To join a guild was to contribute to the work, the costs, and the shared authority of the group. In Latin, the guild was called a corpus, a body, and it was understood exactly as that: each member a limb or organ serving a shared purpose, held together by rules and oaths. Guilds were omnipresent in towns and cities from the High Middle Ages, circa 11th century, into the early modern period, especially in places like Paris, with its strict divisions of métiers, trades; London, where guilds became known as livery companies; Florence, where the powerful Art della Lana, wool guild, helped shape the city's political elite; Cologne, Bruges, and Ghent, where weavers, dyers, and fullers formed complex hierarchies of labor. At their heart, guilds were about control: control of knowledge, production, pricing, apprenticeship, and quality. They dictated how much a loaf of bread should weigh, how many threads per inch a cloth should contain, how many hours a worker could labor, and how apprentices were to be trained and disciplined. And they did so with a slow, methodical authority, one crafted over generations. The path of a craftsman. To become a member of a guild was to walk a long, structured path. It began with the apprenticeship. A child, often between the ages of 10 and 14, would be sent to live in the home of a master craftsman. There he, and less often, she, would learn by watching and doing, often beginning with menial tasks: sweeping floors, preparing materials, maintaining the fire. Over time, the apprentice would progress to handling tools, making simple items, and studying the oral and manual traditions of the craft. Apprenticeship could last 7 to 10 years, depending on the trade and the city's regulations. In return, the master was expected to provide housing, food, basic education, and training. In theory, this was a fair exchange. In practice, it varied greatly. Some apprentices were treated like family, others like servants. After apprenticeship came the journeyman stage, named from the French journée, meaning day, as these workers were paid by the day and often traveled between towns to refine their craft. A journeyman could work independently but was not yet allowed to open a shop, hire others, or sell in the city market without guild approval. To rise to master, a journeyman had to produce a masterpiece, a literal demonstration of exceptional skill, judged by the senior masters of the guild. The piece had to adhere to the guild's exact standards, which could be punishingly precise. A weaver, for example, might be required to produce a length of cloth with specific measurements, thread count, and dye stability under observation. Only after passing this test could one open a shop, hang a sign, and fully join the guild as a voting member. Bakers and their burning rules. Consider the bakers' guild, one of the most strictly regulated professions in medieval cities. Bread was not just food. It was daily survival, especially for the poor, and any disruption in quality or price was considered a civic crisis. In London, the Bakers' Guild was known as the Worshipful Company of Bakers, and its regulations were extensive. Loaves were weighed, prices fixed, and ovens inspected. Masters were forbidden from selling underweight bread, adulterating flour, or hoarding grain. Those who did faced public shamming, fines, and sometimes the pillory, a humiliating punishment. Inspectors known as ale-conners and bread weighers would roam the city checking shops for violations. Infractions could result in a loaf nailed to the offending baker's door, a kind of edible scarlet letter. Why such severity? Because food fraud was common. Cheap flour mixed with chalk or ground beans, loaves soaked to appear heavier, or underbaking to save fuel. These were not small mistakes, they threatened public health and trust. Thus, the Bakers' Guild became both protector and enforcer, preserving not only its members' reputation, but the literal bread of the people. The smell of the tannery. Tanning hides was essential and miserable. Tanners worked with animal skins, soaking them in a foul mixture of urine, lime, and fermented matter, including dog dung, to break down the fat and hair. The stench was overpowering. Tanners' quarters were typically located downwind and downstream, on the edges of towns. Yet leather was vital. It made shoes, belts, armor, bags, saddles, and book covers. The Tanners' Guild, often looked down upon socially, held great economic importance. Their processes were known only to guild insiders and handed down with care, despite their odor. Their tools included curved knives, scrapers, and vats, and the work was seasonal, dependent on temperature and water availability. Apprentice tanners developed strong arms and a high tolerance for filth, but also deep knowledge of materials. Guild rules dictated how long hides must soak, how they should be scraped, and how to dispose of waste, which was both a legal and moral concern. As unpleasant as their trade was, tanners were essential to daily life, and their guilds often held more political power than their social standing suggested. Cloth, color, and complexity. In cities like Bruges, Ghent, and Florence, the weaving guilds dominated both economy and politics. Cloth production was complex and divided into specialized roles. Weavers created the fabric. Fullers washed and thickened it with soap and urine. Dyers applied color, often using secret techniques. Finishers sheared and brushed the fabric for smoothness. Each step had its own guild, with fierce protections against overlap or imitation. Dye recipes were closely guarded. Some colors like deep blue from woad or bright red from kermes, an insect-based dye, were expensive and prized. A flawed dye could ruin weeks of work, and guilds had inspection boards to test color fastness. Quality cloth was a status symbol. Merchants relied on guild seals to guarantee authenticity. A bolt of wool from Florence, bearing the mark of the Art della Lana, could fetch high prices across Europe and Asia. The weavers' guild halls were among the most lavish in medieval cities, often decorated with murals, crests, and intricate looms, a quiet declaration that labor, too, was culture. Guilds and gender. Women played roles in guild life, though often constrained by law and custom. In some cities, widows of masters were allowed to run shops or train apprentices. In cloth and baking trades, women worked as assistants, cleaners, or unofficial producers, sometimes managing the entire workshop behind the scenes. Spinsters, unmarried women who spun thread, formed informal collectives, though they rarely achieved full guild membership. In Paris, the Sewing Guild of St. Anne allowed some female leadership. Still, most guilds limited formal participation to men, especially in trades with military or civic prestige, like armor making or masonry. Yet women's labor remained essential, if often unacknowledged in records. This imbalance would grow more pronounced as capitalist markets began to displace guild systems, turning informal labor into invisible labor. The clock begins to tick. By the 14th and 15th centuries, guilds were at their height of power, regulating trade, funding churches, commissioning art, and shaping civic law. But change was coming. Markets were expanding beyond city walls. Merchants began importing cheaper goods. State governments, especially monarchies, wanted to tax production directly, undermining guild autonomy. The printing press, capitalism, and religious reform all converged to challenge the local, moral economy that guilds represented. And yet, in this moment before the decline, the guilds functioned as a quiet engine of civilization. They were not merely economic institutions. They were keepers of knowledge, arbiters of fairness, and builders of daily life. But how would they survive the coming pressures of scale, speed, and market dominance? In the early hours of a medieval morning, as hammers rang on anvils and looms thudded in rhythm, the city stirred under a quiet but deeply ordered system. The guilds. They were everywhere and nowhere, etched into the walls of public halls, whispered about in council chambers, and stamped onto every loaf of bread, spool of thread, or bolt of dyed cloth. By the 14th century, guilds had reached the peak of their influence, and they were no longer just professional associations. They had become pillars of urban life, weaving together economy, religion, politics, and civic identity into a tight, resilient fabric. But even at their most secure, the seams were beginning to stretch. More than a job, guilds as civic institutions. In the medieval world, to be a member of a guild was to be part of the city's governance, especially in free towns like Florence, Ghent, or London. In Florence, the Arti Maguri, the 7 greater guilds, held not just wealth but political authority. These included the wool merchants Art della Lana, judges and notaries Art dei Giudici e No, and the silk traders Art della Seta. To be elected to Florence's ruling council, the Signoria, one had to be a member of one of these elite guilds. Guild members sponsored cathedrals, confraternities, and hospitals. They funded the building of bridges, paid ransoms for captured citizens, and organized public festivals. Many also maintained charity funds for widows, orphans, and sick members, a rudimentary form of social insurance centuries before the welfare state. In London, the guilds known as livery companies developed elaborate processions, liveries, and feasts, each celebrating their patron saint's day. The Feast of Corpus Christi often saw each guild sponsor floats, performances, and communal banquets. It was civic theater, but also civic identity work made visible as celebration. Yet the guilds weren't equal. There was a clear hierarchy, with the elite merchant guilds wielding disproportionate control, while smaller craft guilds such as bakers, butchers, and smiths struggled for recognition and voice. And beneath them, all were those who remained outside the guilds entirely. Those left out, non-members and outsiders. For all their order and structure, guilds were not inclusive institutions. Membership was limited, sometimes by gender, often by ethnicity, religion, or class. Women, as noted earlier, were largely excluded from full membership, though they often labored in guild households and workshops. Jews in most medieval cities were banned from guilds entirely. Their economic activity limited by law often pushed them into roles like moneylending, which further alienated them from guild society. Foreigners, too, faced restrictions. Many cities required a freedom of the city, essentially a license to trade only granted to locals or those with guild connections. Guilds had an interest in limiting competition. This meant high entry fees, strict apprenticeship requirements, and quotas on the number of masters allowed to operate in a given trade. In Paris, for instance, the Corporation of Surgeons required years of study, expensive fees, and the approval of a panel to allow new members in protecting wages, yes, but also consolidating privilege. Some trades even imposed moral requirements. A butcher in Cologne might be denied guild entry for drunkenness. A blacksmith in Milan could be barred for marrying below his station. This exclusivity became both a strength and a weakness. While it preserved quality and solidarity, it also fostered resentment. As economies shifted and new forms of trade emerged, many found the guilds to be obstacles to innovation and access. The rise of conflict, guilds and the state. As guilds accumulated wealth and political influence, they inevitably came into conflict with rulers. In many cities, kings and dukes sought to centralize authority, often clashing with powerful guilds who resisted external interference. In Flanders, the weavers and fullers guilds led uprisings against both French influence and local elites. The Bruges Matins massacre of 1302, for example, was sparked by guild anger over taxation and foreign domination. In Florence, the rising merchant class, the popolo grasso, clashed with artisan guilds, the popolo menudo, leading to episodes like the Ciampi Revolt of 1378, when wool workers briefly seized control of the city's government before being suppressed. These revolts were not anarchic. They were deeply structured, often seeking greater guild representation, fairer wages, and lower entrance barriers. But they were ultimately quashed by those in power, who feared the leveling instincts of collective labor. And as monarchies grew stronger in the 15th and 16th centuries, they began to circumvent the guilds, granting monopolies, charters, and licenses directly to individuals and companies, weakening the traditional guild structure. Guilds, once semi-autonomous political entities, were being subordinated to the crown. Innovation under pressure. Despite this tension, guilds were not inherently anti-innovation. Within their rules, many fostered remarkable creativity and excellence. The goldsmiths of Augsburg developed new techniques in metal inlay and enamel. The clockmakers, guilds of southern Germany, advanced mechanical design with astonishing precision. Glassblowers in Venice, on the island of Murano, maintained guild-enforced secrecy, ensuring the city's dominance in luxury glass for centuries. Guilds also sponsored technical manuals, trained apprentices in advanced techniques, and kept knowledge alive in a largely illiterate world. But they regulated the pace of change. Innovation was not a race, but a careful unfolding measured, inspected, approved. While this preserved standards, it sometimes stifled rapid adaptation, particularly as global trade and early capitalism began to push for speed and scale. This slow pace would soon be seen as incompatible with the needs of a changing world. The merchant and the factory. By the 16th century, merchant capital had begun to reshape the economy. Rather than purchasing finished goods from guilds, merchants began putting out work buying raw materials, distributing them to rural workers often untrained, and collecting finished goods for sale. This putting out system, also called cottage industry, bypassed the guilds entirely. It allowed merchants to avoid city taxes, quality inspections, and wage regulations. It also undermined guild pricing controls, flooding markets with cheaper goods. Guilds protested. Some cities passed sumptuary laws banning unregulated cloth or foreign-made shoes. Others demanded that only guild-inspected goods could be sold in city markets. But the tide was turning. As nation-states centralized and colonial trade routes expanded, guilds found themselves defensive, fragmented, and increasingly irrelevant. They were not dead, but they were wounded. By the dawn of the 18th century, the guilds had become, in many places, conservative institutions, more concerned with preserving tradition than adapting to change. Yet their values, precision, fairness, accountability did not disappear. Instead, those values would be absorbed into new systems, professional associations, trade unions, certifications, and schools. But how would the guilds face their most profound test? The machines, factories, and wage labor systems of the coming industrial age. By the 17th century, the streets of European cities no longer echoed only with the rhythms of guild workshops. They buzzed with change, new voices, new tools, new forms of work. The Industrial Revolution had not yet arrived, but its early signs were visible. Factories beginning to churn, merchants bypassing guilds to deal directly with rural laborers, and governments consolidating power. The golden age of the guilds was over. But what followed was not an overnight collapse. Rather, it was a slow, drawn-out unraveling, a steady erosion of the guild's authority over time. Like the worn edges of an apprentice's apron, the fray came not from one tier but from daily use and neglect, century after century. From regulation to restriction. For generations, the guilds had stood as defenders of order and fairness, imposing standards and protecting workers from exploitation. But as markets grew and competition intensified, what had once been protective began to seem restrictive. Guild entry fees remained high, locking out younger or poorer workers. Legacy privileges concentrated power in the hands of a few established families. Strict rules about materials and techniques began to stifle adaptation. A new generation of entrepreneurs began to argue that the guilds held back innovation, that they restricted trade, and that they benefited insiders more than society. In many regions, especially in England, France, and the Dutch Republic, monarchs and parliaments began to side with these emerging voices. In England, the Statute of Artificers, 1563, tried to preserve guild authority but also gave the state more control over labor regulation, marking the beginning of the end for autonomous guild control. And by the 17th century, the idea of free trade, promoted by thinkers like Adam Smith, would become a powerful ideological tool to dismantle guild structures entirely. The machines arrive. When the Industrial Revolution finally burst forth in the late 18th century, guilds were utterly unprepared. Factories didn't need skilled masters, they needed cheap, fast labor. Machines could perform tasks that once took years of training to master. A weaver who once spent a decade learning how to tension a loom was suddenly replaced by a machine that could produce cloth 20 times faster. And the factory owners didn't want to consult with guilds. They wanted freedom to set wages, hours, and hearing policies. The old system of apprentice to journeyman to master was discarded for wage labor, a simple transaction of time for money. In cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds, where guilds had once organized the trades, there were soon thousands of workers with no training protections, no quality oversight, no collective voice. The artisan class was fractured. Some tried to adapt, opening small factories of their own. Others clung to traditions, hoping their skills would shield them. Many more joined the growing ranks of the urban poor, laboring for a fraction of what they once earned. The guilds, in response, did not reform fast enough. They had been built for craft economies, not mass production. And as political revolutions swept across Europe from the French Revolution, 1789, To the liberal reforms of 19th century Germany, guilds were seen not as allies of the people, but as obstacles to progress. In France, the Le Chapelier Law of 1791 abolished guilds altogether, declaring that no association of citizens in the same trade or profession may exist. In Prussia and Austria, similar bans or restrictions followed. In England, the guilds lingered as ceremonial livery companies, stripped of their regulatory powers. By 1850, the guild system, at least in its traditional form, was functionally extinct across much of Europe. What remained? But guilds didn't disappear entirely, they transformed. Some evolved into trade unions, especially in industries like metalworking and textiles. Others became professional associations, issuing licenses and maintaining ethical standards in fields like medicine, law, and architecture. Even today, echoes of the guild structure survive. The bar associations for lawyers, the colleges of physicians, the certified trades in skilled manual work, such as electricians, carpenters, and chefs. In fact, the very concept of apprenticeship, with its mentorship, gradual skill acquisition, and certification, remains a cornerstone of many professions. In countries like Germany and Switzerland, vocational education still operates on a dual system, part schooling, part real-world apprenticeship rooted in the guild tradition. And in towns across Europe, the guild halls still stand beautifully preserved structures of wood, stone, and stained glass. They host events, display coat of arms, and sometimes host local councils. They are monuments not to kings, but to labor. What was lost? The death of the guilds brought many gains: economic dynamism, technological progress, and greater market access. But it also left behind losses that are felt to this day. The loss of quality control as production became profit-driven rather than craft-driven. The loss of shared identity among workers replaced by alienation and disconnection. The loss of moral economy where fairness, justice, and community stood alongside profit as central goals. In many ways, the guilds had been not just workplaces but communities. They offered sick pay, funeral benefits, protection for widows, and dignity for workers. They provided a ladder of progress, a sense of purpose and place. In the factory system, that ladder was gone. Wages became arbitrary, hours extended, workers were replaceable. The void left by the guilds would later be filled, imperfectly, by labor movements, cooperatives, and eventually modern welfare states. But none recreated the holistic integration of work, identity, ethics, and community that the guilds once offered. A reflection in the modern world. Today, as technology once again transforms the way we work through automation, digital platforms, and artificial intelligence, many people are asking, what do we lose when work becomes purely transactional? The guilds remind us that work was once more than a paycheck. It was a craft, a calling, and a community. You were known not just by what you made, but how you made it. Your reputation was bound to your product. Your skill was a source of pride. And perhaps in an era of outsourcing, gig labor, and faceless supply chains, we might find wisdom in the old guild mottos. By hand and heart. Measure twice, cut once. Not for gain, but for craft. These phrases are quiet, undramatic, boring even. But they held entire cities together. Because in the end, it wasn't kings or knights who built medieval life. It was the bakers, weavers, tanners, and smiths working together under agreed rules, by lantern light and hand tools, crafting the world one stitch, one board, one brick at a time. And now the question lingers. In a world of global markets and automated labor, is there still space for the slow, careful dignity of the guild? Story 4. The Han Dynasty's paper, from mulberry bark to imperial records. The rustle of parchment, the scraping of bamboo, the careful strokes of a calligraphy brush. Before paper, the written word was a laborious act not only in thought but in medium. Writing required heavy tools: bone, bronze, stone, wood, or bamboo strips. Silk could be written on, but it was costly, far too precious for anything but royal decrees or sacred texts. In the ancient world, the simple act of recording a thought was often restricted to the elite, limited by the cost, the weight, or the availability of suitable writing materials. And then quietly, somewhere around the turn of the 2nd century CE, a new invention began to circulate within the courts and archives of the Han Dynasty. It was made from scraps of bark, cloth, and hemp. It was light, pliable, absorbent, and most importantly, cheap. It was paper. And though it did not arrive with a proclamation or parade, this new medium would go on to reshape the course of human civilization. The world before paper. To understand what paper changed, one must first understand what came before it. In early Chinese history, writing was done on oracle bones, flat pieces of ox scapula or turtle plastron, inscribed with heated bronze tools. These were used for divination, dating back to the Shang Dynasty, c. 1600–1046 BCE. Later, the Zhou Dynasty brought bronze inscriptions and writing on bamboo strips, tied together with cords to form scrolls. These bamboo books were heavy and cumbersome, and writing on them required great care and effort. A single text could weigh several kilograms. For elite writing, silk was used. Known as bo, silk was smooth and durable, but extremely expensive. It was a material of aristocrats and emperors. By the time of the Western Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 9 CE, libraries were expanding, bureaucracy growing, and demand for documentation increasing. The empire needed a material that was light, inexpensive, and abundant. And into this moment of quiet need, the invention of paper appeared. The man behind the method, Kai Lun. The official historical credit for paper's invention goes to Kai Lun, a eunuch and court official serving under Emperor He of Han during the Eastern Han Dynasty. According to the Book of the Later Han, compiled in the 5th century CE, Kai Lun presented his invention to the emperor in 105 CE. He reportedly made paper from a mix of mulberry bark, hemp rags, old fishing nets, and plant fibers, materials that were cheap, abundant, and easily broken down into pulp. His method involved several key steps. Collection and cleaning. Raw materials were gathered, then washed and stripped of impurities. Soaking and fermentation. The fibers were soaked in water and fermented, helping to break them down into a slurry. Beating into pulp. The softened material was pounded or ground into a pulp, a wet, fibrous mash. Suspension in water. The pulp was diluted into a vat of water, forming a uniform suspension. Sheet formation. A flat screen or mold made of bamboo or silk stretched over a frame was dipped into the slurry. As it was lifted, water drained through, leaving a thin, even layer of fibers. Pressing and drying. The wet sheet was pressed to remove excess moisture and then dried flat in the sun or on a heated surface. The result was a single sheet of paper, flexible, smooth, and ready for writing. While archaeological evidence suggests that primitive forms of paper may have existed as early as the 2nd century BCE, Kai Lun is credited with refining and systematizing the process, turning it from a curiosity into a reproducible technology. His innovation earned him imperial praise and courtly status, but more importantly, it opened the door for a radical expansion in literacy, record-keeping, and scholarship. Why paper mattered. The brilliance of Kai Lun's paper was not in its complexity, but in its simplicity. Unlike bamboo, it was lightweight and portable. Unlike silk, it was inexpensive. Unlike stone or bronze, it was abundant and easy to produce. And crucially, paper was absorbent, ideal for ink writing with brushes, the primary writing method in China. Chinese ink made from soot and animal glue adhered beautifully to the fibers, producing bold, expressive strokes. This allowed scribes to write faster, copy documents more easily, and create more uniform scripts. Calligraphy, already an art in Chinese culture, flourished on this new surface. Paper didn't just replace previous materials, it transformed the relationship between people and text. It was no longer necessary to be wealthy or elite to access the written word. With paper, the written word could go anywhere. This shift had quiet but far-reaching consequences. Government archives became easier to manage and expand. Education was no longer bottlenecked by expensive materials. Literary culture, poetry, essays, histories flourished under new accessibility. And in time, paper would move beyond the walls of the imperial bureaucracy into the hands of scholars, merchants, monks, and farmers. The Han bureaucracy and the need for paper. The Han dynasty's administration was vast. It spanned regions, languages, and climates. Officials were expected to report, record, audit, and correspond, and the volume of writing was immense. With bamboo scrolls, entire wagons might be required to transport records. Silk was too costly for ordinary reports. Paper changed that. Imperial offices began to adopt paper for tax records, census documents, judicial rulings, edicts and proclamations. In doing so, the state itself became more nimble. Messages could be dispatched more quickly, duplicates could be made, and archives could expand without massive storage needs. The historian Ban Gu, writing in the 1st century CE, described the imperial library as containing thousands of scrolls. By the end of the Han dynasty, that number had multiplied several-fold, due in part to the storage ease and relative permanence of paper compared to bamboo, which could warp or rot. In short, the Han dynasty became a paper-powered government. Silent transformation. The most remarkable thing about paper's rise in Han China is how quiet it was. There was no immediate cultural revolution, no sudden leap in literacy overnight. Instead, it was a gradual, invisible transformation. More people could afford to write. More records could be kept. More thoughts could be preserved. And because paper was made from waste materials, rags, bark, old nets, it represented a form of recycling, an economy of reuse that made it sustainable and replicable. And yet, despite its potential, paper's use would remain largely confined to East Asia for centuries. It was too valuable a secret to export, and too embedded in Chinese culture to immediately spread. But the question lingers. How did this quiet invention eventually travel across mountains, deserts, and seas into the Islamic world, and then into Europe, changing the course of world history? Some inventions travel loudly, carried by armies, declarations, or ships under royal flags. Others move quietly, folded between pages, carried by monks, merchants, and scribes. Paper light as a whisper, useful as bread, traveled not with conquest but with culture. From the imperial courts of Han China, it journeyed outward, not as a weapon but as a medium, for prayer, memory, philosophy, and law. In the centuries that followed its invention, paper slowly escaped its birthplace, transforming Buddhist monasteries, Islamic libraries, and eventually European printing presses. This is the story of how fibers became bridges between civilizations. The Buddhist path, eastward into Korea and Japan. As the Han dynasty gave way to the Three Kingdoms period in China, c. 220–280 CE, paper began to spread eastward following the same routes as Buddhism. Buddhist monks were among the earliest and most enthusiastic adopters of paper. The need to copy sutras, sacred texts, was urgent and constant. On bamboo or wood, this work was exhausting. On silk, it was prohibitively expensive. But on paper, it was suddenly possible to produce and disseminate teachings on a wide scale. By the 4th century CE, paper had reached Korea, where it was integrated into state bureaucracy and monastic life. From there, it crossed to Japan in the 6th century, likely via diplomatic envoys and Buddhist missions. In Japan, paper, called kami, took on both sacred and secular uses. It was used in Shinto rituals, folded into shapes, shied, and used to mark sacred spaces. Buddhist monks used it to copy scriptures, and eventually to produce the world's oldest known printed text, the Hyakumanto Dharani, c. 770 CE. A Dharani, chant, printed on paper and stored in miniature pagodas. By the Heian period, Japanese aristocrats were writing poetry on handmade washi, prized for its texture and absorbency. Paper had become more than a surface, it was a conduit for spiritual expression. A turning point, the Battle of Talas, 751 CE. While the eastward spread of paper was gentle and spiritual, its westward journey took a sharp turn through conflict. In 751 CE, the Battle of Talas was fought between the Tang dynasty of China and the Abbasid Caliphate, recently risen to power in the Islamic world. The battle took place near the Talas River, in present-day Kyrgyzstan, and though small in scale, it carried a pivotal cultural consequence. According to Arab chroniclers, among the prisoners taken by the Abbasids were Chinese papermakers, skilled artisans, who knew the secrets of making mulberry bark paper. Whether the story is literal or symbolic, what followed is clear. Within a few decades of the battle, paper mills began to appear in Samarkand, a key city on the Silk Road, under Abbasid control. From there, paper began to filter through the Islamic world, carried by scholars and scribes, who copied the Quran, poetry, and legal texts onto the new medium. Traders, who used it for contracts and correspondence. Administrators, who adopted it for state archives. The Abbasids, centered in Baghdad, were quick to see paper's potential. Under Caliph Harun al-Rashid and later al-Mamun, the Abbasid court oversaw a translation movement, converting Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit texts into Arabic. Paper made this surge of knowledge preservation and dissemination vastly more efficient. By the 9th century, Baghdad had dozens of paper shops, and paper was being used in government, science, and philosophy. The Islamic world didn't just adopt paper, it improved it. Innovation in the Islamic world. While Chinese paper relied heavily on mulberry and hemp, Islamic papermakers adapted to local resources using linen and flax, often recycled from rags and worn-out textiles. This gave rise to what became known as rag paper, which had a finer texture and proved more durable. Muslim craftsmen also innovated in sizing, treating paper with starch or other substances to make it less absorbent and better for ink clarity. Watermarks, subtle designs embedded into the paper, used to identify origin or prevent forgery. Binding, Islamic bookbinders developed beautiful, functional methods of sewing and covering books, creating the codex form, rather than scrolls as the dominant format. The result was a flourishing book culture. Libraries in cities like Cordoba, Fez, Cairo, and Baghdad contained tens of thousands of volumes, copied by hand but written on lightweight, accessible paper. Islamic civilization became, in a sense, the first truly paper-based culture, embracing it not only for religious and literary use, but for science, medicine, law, and engineering. And again, as in China, paper quietly democratized literacy. It was no longer only emperors or priests who could write and read, it was merchants, judges, scholars, and travelers. By the 12th century, paper mills existed throughout the Muslim world, from Persia to Andalusia. Which brings us to Europe. Slow arrival in the West. Though Europe had long traded with the Islamic world, it remained slow to adopt paper. Parchment made from animal skin was the preferred medium for scribes and monks. It was durable, traditional, and trusted. But it was also expensive and slow to produce. A single Bible could require the skins of over 200 sheep. Still, the influence of Islamic paper culture could not be ignored forever. The turning point came via Spain and Sicily, both under Islamic rule for portions of the Middle Ages. In Zadova, near Valencia, Europe's first paper mill was established in the 12th century, modeled on Arabic techniques. Christian scribes and merchants began to recognize the value of paper for record keeping, legal contracts, correspondence, scientific manuscripts. Yet adoption was uneven. Some institutions viewed paper with suspicion. In 1231, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II issued an edict forbidding the use of paper in official documents, fearing it was too easy to forge or decay. But paper's cost advantage was undeniable. As trade grew and towns expanded, paper offered a means to support rising literacy rates, bureaucratic growth, and eventually printing. By the late 13th century, Italy had multiple paper mills, and cities like Fabriano began producing high-quality rag paper that would spread throughout Europe. Paper's final moment of transformation would come not through merchants or monks, but through a metal press in Germany, a device that would launch 1,000 books and change history again. But before we arrive there, we must ask, how did paper help usher in the Renaissance, and what did it do to knowledge when paired with ink and mass production? By the 15th century, paper had become a common material in many parts of Europe, still viewed with suspicion in some ecclesiastical circles and cherished in others. It had already begun to displace parchment in secular courts, merchant houses, and universities. But it was still laboriously hand-copied. Books were rare. Literacy was limited. Knowledge, though slowly seeping outward, remained largely bottled in monasteries and royal courts. And then, around 1440, a man in Mainz, Johannes Gutenberg, combined three technologies: the wine press, metal movable type, and oil-based ink, to create a machine that would forever alter the relationship between people and the written word. It was a machine that would have been meaningless without paper. The printing press meets the perfect partner. Gutenberg's innovation was not just mechanical, it was systemic. By carving individual metal type pieces that could be arranged, inked, and pressed onto a surface, he made it possible to produce hundreds of identical pages in a fraction of the time it took to copy them by hand. Parchment, though revered, was too inflexible, too expensive, and too labor-intensive for the scale Gutenberg envisioned. Only paper, with its absorbent surface and pliable texture, could support such output. The Gutenberg Bible, the first major printed book in the West, was printed on both vellum and paper editions, but the paper copies were cheaper and more widely distributed. From this point forward, paper and printing became inseparable. Paper allowed printers to mass-produce books, pamphlets, letters, maps, and more, lower the cost of written material dramatically, reach wider audiences, including merchants, students, and artisans, and in turn, printing elevated paper from a useful writing surface to the foundation of mass communication. By 1500, printing presses existed in over 250 cities across Europe. More than 20 million books had been printed, and paper mills were working overtime to meet the demand. A quiet material, once made by court eunuchs from hemp and bark, had become the vessel of a new age. Literacy and the paper flood. With paper, books could be printed not just in Latin, but in vernacular languages: German, French, English, Italian. Religious tracts, educational materials, manuals, almanacs, and even early newspapers became widespread. People who had once only heard sermons now read them. Farmers read calendars. Midwives consulted medical pamphlets. Sailors read charts. Literacy, long confined to monasteries and universities, began to filter into towns and villages. Paper allowed education to leave the cathedral and enter the home. And with that came a cascade of change. The Protestant Reformation, 1517 onward, was fueled by paper. Martin Luther's tracts, letters, and German Bibles circulated quickly because of it. Scientific inquiry expanded. Galileo, Newton, and others published and spread ideas that crossed borders on sheets of paper. Political theory flourished. Rousseau, Locke, Hobbes all wrote treatises that would eventually shape constitutions and revolutions. Maps and exploration expanded. New lands, new trade routes, and colonial ambitions all depended on documentation, contracts, and communication. Behind all of this was the simple economic and physical utility of paper: foldable, cuttable, portable, and easy to reproduce. And yet, even with its rise, most people rarely stopped to think about it. Paper became so commonplace, so unremarkable, that its importance faded into the background. But civilizations are often built on exactly this kind of infrastructure. Things so embedded in daily life that we stop seeing them. Global spread and industrialization. After Europe embraced paper and printing, the material quickly became global. Colonial administrators brought European-style paper mills to the Americas, Africa, and South Asia. Missionaries and merchants carried paper into remote regions, distributing religious texts, grammars, and educational booklets. Government offices, especially in colonial regimes, used paper for taxation, census taking, and bureaucratic expansion. But the real transformation came with the Industrial Revolution. By the early 19th century, paper was being made not by hand, but by machine. The Fourdrinier machine, invented in the early 1800s in England, could produce continuous rolls of paper, rather than individual sheets. Wood pulp began to replace rags as the primary raw material, cheaper, but with trade-offs in durability. Steam-powered presses dramatically increased the speed of printing. Newspapers exploded, literacy campaigns were launched, textbooks were mass-produced. Paper had moved from artisanal to industrial. But something was lost, too. The textures of handmade fiber, the personal craftsmanship, the slow rhythm of the vat and screen, all of these began to disappear under the hum of machines. Paper, once sacred and precious, became ephemeral. Used, discarded, forgotten. The irony of fragility. Despite its central role in modern history, paper is fragile. It burns easily, decays in moisture, crumbles with age. Wars, floods, and neglect have destroyed millions of documents, silencing voices that once whispered across continents. Libraries burn. Archives rot. Letters vanish. And yet, some of the earliest paper made in China, mulberry and hemp-based, still survives, legible after 2,000 years. The irony is sharp. The oldest paper is stronger than much of what we make today. This raises a quiet question about value and permanence. We mass-produce information, archive endlessly, yet few things are built to last. Paper was once a labor of care. Today, it's often a disposable surface, eclipsed by screens and servers. Still, it remains all around us, not as scrolls or sutras, but as receipts, packaging, ballots, and books. What paper taught us? Paper's story is not about one invention. It's about the power of small, material changes to reshape entire civilizations. It is about access, allowing people to read, write, and preserve without wealth or power. Memory, carrying thought beyond a single life, place, or language. Mobility, shrinking the distance between author and reader. Simplicity, solving a problem not with complexity, but with modest tools and waste materials. From hand bureaucrats to Islamic librarians, from Renaissance printers to factory papermakers, this invention endured not because of glamour, but because it worked. It carried poetry and prayer, law and heresy, maps, mistakes, confessions, plans, Everything we wanted to remember we put on paper. A final reflection. Paper is now being replaced page by pixel. The world is moving into clouds, drives, and screens, and yet we still print, we still pass notes, we still turn pages. Because something happens when ink meets fiber, something ancient, something human. And so you might wonder, as we let go of paper, what else might we forget to preserve? Story 5. The Great Fire of London's Rebuilding. Bricks, mortar, and endless plans. You are standing on a narrow street, the sky overhead pinched by the jutting timber frames of upper stories. The buildings lean forward slightly, casting crooked shadows, their walls warped from years of uneven weathering and rebuilding. The air is thick with the smells of ale, wood smoke, tallow, and damp straw. Beneath your feet, the uneven cobblestones bear the stains of generations' mud, soot, and worse. This is London in the summer of 1666, a medieval city in spirit, though it exists in the 17th century, a city full of noise, life, stench, and worry. Despite its importance as a commercial capital, London is still a fire trap. Nearly 80,000 tightly packed residents live in wooden homes, roofed with tar and thatch. Chimneys belch soot constantly. Candles flicker behind curtains. Hearths glow all night in bakeries and taverns. And yet, life goes on, as if this kindling of a city is invulnerable. For now, a city before modernity. Before the fire that would reshape London, the city was a blend of contradiction, part feudal holdover, part emerging metropolis. While the country had been through the English Civil War, regicide, and restoration, its capital remained spatially medieval. Many buildings were still half-timbered, made from wooden beams with plaster infill. Overhanging stories called jetties narrowed the streets as they climbed upward, sometimes allowing neighbors to shake hands from opposite windows. The streets themselves were labyrinthine. Some were unnamed. Others changed names halfway through. Drainage was poor. Open sewers still ran through parts of the city. Night soil, human waste, was often dumped from windows into gutters, and animals, especially pigs, still roamed freely in certain wards. Fires were common. Not just once a year, but every week, some blaze would scorch a portion of the city. Most were extinguished before they could spread. Thatched roofs had been banned in 1212, but enforcement was lax, and many remained. Firefighting consisted mostly of buckets, firehooks, and prayers. And yet, Londoners lived amid this kindling with relative peace. Until a spark from a bakery turned caution into catastrophe. The fire begins. It started just past midnight on Sunday, September 2nd, 1666, at the King's Bakery on Pudding Lane, owned by Thomas Fariner. His family escaped the house, but a maidservant did not. She became the fire's first victim. What followed was not an immediate panic. Fires were so common that most assumed it would be managed. A bucket brigade was formed. Neighbors helped douse nearby roofs. It seemed, for a moment, containable. But then the wind picked up, a strong easterly wind that blew hot embers across lanes, roofs, and awnings. The flames leapt from building to building. Sparks entered open windows. Tarred rooftops ignited, and the city's wooden heart began to burn. By dawn, the fire had consumed dozens of buildings. By noon, it was unstoppable. Firefighting in the 17th century. To fight a fire in 1666 was to rely on desperation and rudimentary tools. Buckets of water passed hand to hand in long lines. Firehooks, large poles with hooks, used to pull down burning or threatened buildings to create fire breaks. Gunpowder, sometimes used to blow up structures in the fire's path, though this was controversial and required approval. The Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, hesitated. Legend says he responded to calls for building demolition with, "Pish, a woman could piss it out." This delay would prove devastating. The wind continued, the fire grew. By Monday, it had reached Lombard Street, and by Tuesday, St. Paul's Cathedral, the heart of London's religious identity, was burning. The cathedral, thought to be a refuge due to its thick stone walls, had been used to store books, manuscripts, and merchandise. Its lead roof melted, its timbers blazed, and the cathedral collapsed. Flames now leapt across the Thames, igniting wharves, warehouses, and homes on the south bank. The city was, quite literally, eating itself. And still, people hesitated to destroy homes. This was not just fear, it was legal ambiguity. If a man pulled down another man's home, even to save the city, he might be sued for damages later. And so, destruction was delayed. By the time King Charles II personally intervened, ordering fire breaks, commanding the use of gunpowder, and organizing troops, the city's fate was largely sealed. The human side of the disaster. As buildings burned, the people fled, first with possessions, then with family, and finally with only themselves. Some loaded carts and boats, evacuating across London Bridge or along the Thames. Others camped in fields and churchyards, watching the smoke rise for days. Pickpockets and looters emerged, stealing goods and jewelry. Rumors swirled that the fire was deliberate, perhaps started by foreign agents or Catholics. Xenophobic violence flared briefly. By Wednesday, September 5th, the wind finally died down. On Thursday, the fire was largely extinguished. But the damage was already unimaginable. What the fire consumed. In just 4 days, the Great Fire of London destroyed 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, 44 company halls, St. Paul's Cathedral, most of the city's government buildings, warehouses, and markets. Roughly 80% of the walled city of London, the old Roman and medieval core, was gone. And yet, remarkably, the death toll was officially recorded as very low, only a handful of confirmed fatalities. Most modern historians believe this is a significant undercount, as many bodies would have been incinerated completely, especially among the poor. But the greater tragedy was not just what was lost, it was the chaos of what to do next. A city had been burned to the ground, but it had not been destroyed. Its people remained hungry, cold, and uncertain. Where would they go? Who would rebuild? And how? In the early morning light of September 6, 1666, London stood still. Smoke drifted over mounds of rubble, timber skeletons, and shattered chimneys. Where winding lanes once buzzed with hawkers and horses, there now lay a silent, ashen maze. The sky, streaked with soot, held the weight of something unspoken. What now? More than 80,000 Londoners were suddenly homeless, their possessions gone, their businesses destroyed, their churches leveled. And yet the city remained. Not its buildings, but its people, its customs, its memory. And so began the slow, hesitant, often frustrating work of rebuilding a capital. But where to begin when there is no city left? Temporary London, fields, tents, and makeshift markets. In the weeks that followed the fire, London's displaced population settled into temporary camps on the outskirts. Fields in Moorfields, Islington, and Finsbury filled with tents, carts, and rough wooden huts. Merchants set up makeshift stalls. Churches held services in open air. Courts met in hastily constructed chambers. Even printing presses resumed, issuing pamphlets, fire sermons, and inevitably blame. King Charles II ordered bread and coal to be distributed. The Crown established public soup kitchens, but aid was limited. Many people relied on neighbors, parishes, and trade guilds to survive. And then came the plans, grand, sweeping, unrealistic plans. Wren, Evelyn, and the architects of a new London. Even before the ashes cooled, ideas began to swirl in coffee houses and court chambers. What if London could be rebuilt better? Enter Christopher Wren, John Evelyn, and Robert Hooke, scholars, architects, and surveyors of the Royal Society. Each produced plans to redesign the city. Wren's plan envisioned a city of wide boulevards, symmetrical blocks, and public squares inspired by Rome and Paris. Evelyn proposed a similar layout, with canals, straight roads, and zoning to separate trades. Others suggested turning the Thames into a central axis, with bridges and quays designed to rival Amsterdam. These visions shared a dream: to erase the medieval chaos and impose rational order on the city. It was the Enlightenment, after all. But none of these plans were adopted. Why? Property rights. The land still belonged to individuals. No one wanted to surrender it for idealized geometry. Surveying delays. With the streets obliterated, it took weeks just to measure and map the damage. Political pressure. People wanted to return to normal quickly, not wait years for sweeping redesigns. In the end, the city was largely rebuilt on its original footprint, with modest improvements. The opportunity to radically remake London had passed, but not everything remained the same. Parliament acts, bricks appear. The government, to its credit, moved swiftly to regulate rebuilding. On September 13, 1666, Parliament passed the Rebuilding Act, which set out strict rules. No more timber-framed buildings in the city center. All new structures must use brick or stone. Street widths were to be adjusted, some widened, others straightened. Building heights were capped to prevent overhangs and collapse. Party walls shared between buildings were to be thicker and fire-resistant. These regulations weren't optional. The city appointed surveyors, including Wren and Hooke, to oversee compliance. For the first time, building code enforcement in London had real teeth. This shift from wood to brick and stone was transformative, not just aesthetically but practically. Bricks were less flammable. Stone structures lasted longer. The city took on a more uniform, sober appearance, the start of what we now call Georgian architecture. This wasn't immediate. Brick production had to be scaled up, skilled masons had to be hired, materials transported, and everything was expensive. Many former residents couldn't afford to rebuild and were pushed outward, reshaping London's suburbs. St. Paul's rises again. Among the greatest symbols of renewal was St. Paul's Cathedral. After the fire, only blackened ruins remained of the old Gothic cathedral. It had stood for centuries, a patchwork of medieval repairs and additions. Now, it was beyond saving. The Crown commissioned Christopher Wren to design a new St. Paul. His design was bold, a Baroque cathedral inspired by Roman domes and Renaissance proportion, but his first proposal was rejected too daring. His second was a compromise, but in 1675, Wren quietly began to build his original vision, knowing it would be appreciated over time. Construction took 35 years. The final cathedral, with its soaring dome, symmetrical geometry, and sculptural detail, became the spiritual heart of the new London, a quiet triumph of resilience and design. And Wren, who once hoped to remake the entire city, found in St. Paul's his legacy: trade guilds and the return of work. While plans and cathedrals took decades, commerce returned quickly. The Royal Exchange was rebuilt by 1669. Guild halls resumed operation. Shops reopened in wooden sheds, later replaced by permanent stone premises. Insurance companies, most famously Lloyd's, emerged to protect against future fire loss. Fire marks were affixed to buildings, indicating coverage. Some even hired private fire brigades. The guilds, especially masons, carpenters, and bricklayers, gained influence. There was more work than ever, and their skills were in demand. The rebuilding period became a boom time for laborers, craftsmen, and landowners who could afford to reconstruct. But not all were winners. Those left behind. Many smallholders and renters couldn't rebuild. With property lost and no funds to rebuild under the new codes, they migrated outward to Spitalfields, Southwark, and beyond. This pushed the city's growth into new suburbs, accelerating urban sprawl. The poor, once packed into the inner city, now lived in fringe communities, some makeshift, some slowly formalizing. And as London rebuilt, it began to take on a new shape, a denser core of stone and commerce, surrounded by looser belts of housing, markets, and future industries. This was not just recovery, it was transformation. But what had the fire really taught the city? What had been lost not just in buildings, but in possibility? The Great Fire of 1666 is often remembered for its spectacular destruction. A city consumed in just 4 days, its cathedral collapsed, its skyline scorched. But its true impact was far more gradual and, in many ways, far more subtle. London did not simply rebuild. It redefined how cities live with risk. It created systems, expectations, and habits that extended far beyond the ruins of timber homes and into the very blueprint of the modern city. The fire itself became a case study in prevention. In the decades and centuries that followed, cities across the world began to ask, what if we build before the next disaster? The rise of fire insurance. Before the fire, the idea of fire insurance was rare, fragmented, and largely theoretical. After the fire, it became a necessity. In 1681, just 15 years after the flames, the Fire Office, the first successful fire insurance company, was established. Others followed. The Friendly Society, 1683. The Hand-in-Hand Fire and Life Insurance Society, 1696. And most famously, Lloyd's of London, which would become a global insurance market. These companies didn't just sell policies, they hired private fire brigades. These brigades would respond only to buildings insured by their company, identified by metal plaques known as fire marks attached to the front. It was a competitive and chaotic system at first. If your building didn't have the right fire mark, help might not come. Some brigades fought each other at fire scenes. Others were accused of starting small fires to drum up business. But from this disorder emerged a system of urban risk management that endures to this day. Actuarial tables, risk assessment based on building materials, the concept of shared liability and community protection. Without the fire, these systems might have evolved much later, if at all. And they weren't just about buildings, they signaled a shift in thinking. Disasters are not inevitable. They can be priced, mitigated, and planned for. Urban planning's uneven progress. While London returned largely to its original street plan, the fire still influenced how cities were imagined. Architects and planners, especially in Europe, began to favor wider boulevards, separation of buildings by fire-resistant barriers, standardized heights and materials, zoning based on activity. Paris, under Baron Haussmann 2 centuries later, would transform with massive boulevards partly designed to prevent the spread of fire and, conveniently, to hinder revolutionaries. Other cities such as Philadelphia, Lisbon, and Chicago would experience their own fires and learn from London's model. And yet, not all cities followed. Even London fell into periods of complacency. In 1834, another great fire destroyed the Houses of Parliament. And in 1888, the Whitechapel area, home to many of the poor displaced after 1666, was still filled with flammable housing, unsanitary conditions, and narrow alleys. The city had changed, but not enough for everyone. Psychological and cultural memory. The Great Fire also left an imprint on the British psyche. It became the subject of sermons about sin and divine punishment, pamphlets urging reform and repentance, plays and poems reflecting on the fragility of human achievement, and notably scapegoating. In the weeks after the fire, rumors spread that the fire had been started by foreigners, particularly Catholics. Anti-immigrant violence flared. A French watchmaker named Robert Hubert was arrested and falsely confessed to arson. He was executed even though it was later proven he had arrived in London after the fire began. This panic left its own legacy. A permanent plaque on the base of the monument, erected to commemorate the fire, originally blamed the treachery and malice of the popish faction. It was removed in the 19th century. The fire taught Londoners about flame, but also about fear and how quickly it spreads in uncertain times. The monument and the lessons etched in stone. In 1671, construction began on the monument to the Great Fire of London, a 202-foot-tall column designed by Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke. It stands near Pudding Lane, the fire's origin. Inscribed into its stone are not only the dates and statistics but a message. London rises again. The monument wasn't just commemorative, it was also functional. It doubled as a scientific instrument, with a spiral staircase and hollow core for barometric experiments. Its height, 202 feet, is precisely the distance from its base to the bakery on Pudding Lane. London's past, literally measured in flame and stone. And in that monument, a new civic memory was born. That catastrophe, while terrible, could birth a stronger future if only we chose to learn. Wren's legacy and the persistence of brick. Though Wren never saw his master plans for the city realized, he left behind something greater. St. Paul's Cathedral and 51 rebuilt churches, all done in stone. These weren't just places of worship, they were architectural statements. Of resilience over fragility. Of order over chaos. Of a city reclaimed by design. Brick became the new language of London, giving rise to Georgian terraces, row houses, and public buildings that defined the city for centuries. Even today, when fire codes are standard and steel frames dominate, brick remains a quiet monument to that decision. Never again should wood and carelessness set a city ablaze. Beyond London, a global cautionary tale. The Great Fire of London wasn't the only urban blaze, but it was one of the first where the recovery was documented, regulated, and legislated at a national level. In its ashes, urban theory was born. Chicago, after its fire in 1871, studied London's rebuilding when drafting new building codes. Tokyo, struck by fire and earthquake multiple times, adopted zoning and material changes based on the London model. Modern fire drills, fire escapes, and urban evacuation planning all trace lineage in some form to this moment. It's easy to forget that many cities once feared total destruction from fire. Today, we prepare for earthquakes, hurricanes, and rising seas. But for centuries, fire was the #1 threat. And it still is in some parts of the world. As urban areas expand into dry zones, as climate change increases heat and drought, we see wildfires threatening suburbs, towns, and cities from California to Australia. Which brings us to the modern question. What have we forgotten? After 1666, fire was seen as predictable, a matter of materials, design, and planning. But as modern threats evolve, so do our blind spots. Do we still plan cities with risk in mind? Do we invest in infrastructure that protects the vulnerable? Or do we, like London before the fire, live in comfort until crisis strikes? Fire taught London to build not just quickly, but wisely. And yet even today, rebuilding after disaster often favors speed over foresight, profit over resilience. The lesson of the Great Fire is not in the ash but in the choices made after. Not just rebuilding the same thing, but asking, what should a city be not just now, but 100 years from now? Story 6. The invention of glass mirrors and the rise of self-perception. Imagine a world without your own face. Not a world of darkness or blindness, but a world where your own appearance is unknown, at best a vague guess. A world where people go their entire lives without seeing themselves clearly. No selfies, no bathroom mirrors, no glass storefronts reflecting your gait, no photos, no paintings except for the privileged few. This was not long ago. For much of human history, the human face was something you only saw on others. And the image you held of yourself, your expressions, your flaws, your beauty was based on descriptions, imagination, and shadows. Until one of the most quietly transformative objects in history emerged, the glass mirror. But like all things that now feel inevitable, its arrival was neither fast nor straightforward. It took centuries of trial, accident, trade, and secrecy to make mirrors clear, reliable, and widely available. And in that process, something deep within society changed something about how we see ourselves, literally and metaphorically. The earliest mirrors, obsidian and polished stone. The idea of a mirror is ancient. Humans have always found ways to glimpse themselves, if only briefly. Some of the earliest known mirrors were made as early as 6000 BCE in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. These were polished obsidian discs, volcanic glass ground smooth until they reflected light. They were small, dark, and imperfect. Later civilizations improved the technique. Bronze Age mirrors, around 2000 BCE, were made of polished copper, tin, or bronze, often circular with a handle. Ancient Egyptians, Mesopotamians, and Chinese all used metal mirrors. Some Roman mirrors even used silver or gold-plated surfaces, offering slightly clearer images. But all of these had limitations. They tarnished quickly. The reflections were dim, distorted, and required bright lighting. They were expensive and often considered luxury items, reserved for priests, nobility, or rituals. The average person in 500 BCE would have had no access to their own face, except in still water or when glimpsing themselves in someone else's eyes. It's hard to grasp what this absence means until you realize. There was no such thing as a selfie until there was such thing as a self to capture. Mirrors in ritual and myth. Because mirrors were rare and precious, they were often imbued with meaning far beyond utility. In Chinese folklore, mirrors revealed truth, warded off evil spirits, and symbolized moral clarity. In Greek mythology, Narcissus was doomed to fall in love with his reflection. In still water, an early cautionary tale about self-obsession, before the mirror even existed. Mirrors became symbols of truth and vanity in medieval Europe. In Christian thought, the mirror reflected not just the face, but the soul, and the soul, inevitably, was flawed. This blend of awe, fear, and fascination ensured that mirrors, when they eventually became reliable, would carry philosophical weight beyond their technical use. But centuries would pass before technology allowed a mirror to show the face clearly enough to contemplate it. Venice, the secret city of glass. The breakthrough didn't happen in Egypt, Greece, or China, but on the small island of Murano, off the coast of Venice. By the 13th century, Venetian glassmakers had become the finest in Europe, and the Republic of Venice, eager to protect its monopoly, moved all glass production to Murano in 1291. This wasn't just for safety. Glass furnaces were fire hazards. It was economic strategy. The Venetian government treated its glassmakers like state secrets. They were forbidden to leave the island. Techniques were guarded like military intelligence. Defectors were hunted down, and their families often punished. And so Murano became the world's capital of glass. The craftsmen there developed crystalline glass, refined blowing techniques, and eventually mirrors made from glass backed with tin mercury amalgam. This technique, developed around the 14th to 15th century, allowed clearer, brighter reflection, larger mirror surfaces, more consistent production. A new kind of mirror had arrived, no longer a fuzzy metal disc, but a polished sheet of glass that truly reflected the world. Luxury and control. In the 1500s and 1600s, Venetian mirrors were among the most expensive luxury items in Europe. Kings and queens paid fortunes for a single pane. Mirrors adorned the halls of palaces, not homes. Their presence signified wealth, power, and a kind of visual modernity. Consider this. In 1680, a large Venetian mirror could cost more than a painting by a master artist. A mirror was not just a reflection, it was a status symbol. France, hungry to rival Venice, began its own clandestine operation. In the mid-17th century, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, finance minister to Louis XIV, bribed Venetian glassmakers to bring their techniques to France. Thus began the birth of the French mirror industry, most famously seen in the Hall of Mirrors, Galerie des Glaces, at Versailles, constructed in the 1670s. 17 massive mirrors reflect the sunlight and gardens, creating a palace that sees itself infinite times over. Mirrors had become a reflection of power. But quietly, in the background, mirror making was becoming more accessible. The seeds of mass production had been planted. The middle class and the mirror. By the 18th and 19th centuries, mirrors were no longer confined to royalty. Advances in glassblowing and metal coating allowed smaller, cheaper mirrors. The rise of the middle class meant more people could afford modest mirrors for grooming and vanity. Mirror manufacturers emerged in England, Bohemia, and later Germany. By the mid-1800s, a major technical change occurred. Justus von Liebig, a German chemist, developed a method to deposit a thin layer of silver onto glass. This innovation became the foundation of modern mirror production, cheap, clear, and safe. The mirror was finally democratized. Now anyone could see themselves clearly. And with that, a deeper change began, one not just in reflection but in self-perception. By the late 19th century, the mirror was no longer a rare and curious object for kings and clerics. It had entered bedrooms, shops, salons, and schools. No longer confined to wealth or worship, mirrors had become common, and with them, a new kind of human introspection. And yet, few people stopped to think what this meant. For the first time in history, ordinary people could see themselves regularly and clearly, every wrinkle, every gesture, every out-of-place strand of hair. With that came not only grooming and vanity, but also a quiet revolution in the way people experienced identity. The mirror was not just glass and silver. It was a new mental instrument, a lens for self-awareness, and perhaps most importantly, a tool for self-construction. The rise of grooming and personal appearance. Before mass-produced mirrors, personal grooming was rudimentary and guided more by routine than self-inspection. But by the 19th century, barbershops and hair salons began incorporating wall mirrors. Dressing tables with mirrors became standard in middle-class homes. Compact mirrors and handheld mirrors became portable accessories for women. This changed daily routines. People began to adjust their posture, comb their hair differently, practice facial expressions, and even study their emotions. The self ceased to be just a feeling. It became a visual object. This visual consciousness had effects across culture. Fashion became more competitive and personal. Etiquette manuals offered advice on how to present oneself, not just behave. Even children, exposed to their own reflections early on, began to form identities through appearance rather than roles alone. Where identity had once been told to you by birth, occupation, or family, it was now something you could see and possibly change. Mirrors in literature and psychology. As mirrors spread, so did metaphors. Writers, philosophers, and eventually psychologists began to reflect on reflection. In fairy tales, mirrors became devices of truth or vanity, like the magic mirror in Snow White, which tells not what you want to hear, but what is. In Victorian literature, mirrors became symbols of introspection, madness, or alternate realities. See Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray, whose portrait, a kind of reflective twin, ages and decays while he does not. Sigmund Freud and later Jacques Lacan explored how mirrors shape the ego. Lacan famously theorized the mirror stage, in infant development, a moment when a child first recognizes itself in a mirror and forms a sense of I. This was more than metaphor. The visual feedback loop of the mirror gave people the opportunity to create themselves in real time. You could see yourself sad and pretend to smile. You could rehearse a speech, monitor your tone, check your stance. You could even, by repetition, become more like the person you imagined you wanted to be. In this way, the mirror quietly unlocked a form of private performance. What had once been hidden inside was now shaped by what could be seen outside. The birth of the modern mirror world. As cities modernized, mirrors leapt from bedrooms and salons into public space. Department stores used full-length mirrors to encourage purchases. Tailors and milliners created mirrored fitting rooms. Elevators began adding mirrors to calm claustrophobia and create the illusion of space. Even train stations, theaters, and hotels adopted mirrors as both design and function, multiplying light, enlarging interiors, and feeding the growing culture of self-surveillance. And with each reflection, people adjusted, standing straighter, fixing their collar, questioning their appearance. It was not just about vanity. The mirror became a tool for belonging, a way to verify that one looked proper, correct, or respectable. Especially for immigrants, women, and the working class striving for social mobility, mirrors became a silent tutor in assimilation. And then came photography. Photography, the mirror's rival. The invention of photography in the 19th century didn't replace mirrors, but it transformed how reflection worked. For the first time, you could see yourself as others saw you, not just mirrored. You could freeze moments, examine your own body, posture, or smile. You could distribute your image, creating a public identity beyond your physical presence. Portraits had once been rare. Now they became keepsakes, calling cards, and documents of existence. By the early 20th century, people posed for photographs with care, often using a mirror beforehand to practice the image they wanted to present. A new cycle emerged. Look in mirror, right arrow. Adjust, right arrow. Pose for photo, right arrow. Receive photo, right arrow. Reflect again. This recursive loop began to define modern self-perception. The psychology of the self. As the 20th century advanced, psychologists began to understand just how profoundly mirrors shape our identity. Experiments showed that animals placed in front of a mirror often reacted with confusion or aggression, interpreting their reflection as another being. Only a few great apes, dolphins, elephants seemed to recognize themselves. Children, too, take time to understand the mirror. Before 18 months, most infants treat their reflection as another baby. By 2 years old, they begin to understand, that is me. This ability, mirror recognition, is now a standard test for self-awareness in developmental psychology. But what happens when that mirror becomes constant? Mirrors and the growth of insecurity. As mirrors became widespread, so too did self-critique. People began noticing imperfections they never would have seen before. Advertisers and product makers fueled body anxiety, offering creams, corsets, powders, and tonics to fix what one saw. Mirrors allowed people to compare themselves not only to others, but to idealized versions of themselves. The more we looked, the more we found to dislike. A generation that had never seen its own pores now stared into them daily. And while this may sound trivial, it shaped everything from fashion trends to mental health. The very tool that allowed self-awareness could also foster self-doubt. And in modern times, That concern has only grown, especially as mirrors now compete with screens. From silvered glass to digital reflection. Today, most people carry a mirror in their pocket, the front-facing camera of a smartphone. We no longer wait for a glance in the glass. We flip the lens, tilt our face, adjust lighting, and take reflections with us wherever we go. And yet mirrors remain. In hotel lobbies, in gyms, on car visors, in store dressing rooms. We now expect to see ourselves constantly. But as the mirror gave us the power to reflect, it also raised a deeper question. Who are we when we're not looking? Or put another way, has the mirror helped us know ourselves better, or simply perform ourselves more thoroughly? In this tension between being and appearing, the humble glass mirror has become one of the quiet architects of modern selfhood. Mirrors for centuries helped us discover who we were visually, emotionally, and culturally. They offered clarity but also control. They showed us our flaws and gave us the power to adjust them. Yet as the 20th century turned into the 21st, a curious thing happened. We began to move beyond the mirror. Not by removing them from our lives, but by integrating their function into everything: our screens, our devices, our social structures. The mirror was once a fixed object of glass and silver. Now, we are surrounded by invisible mirrors, tracking, reflecting, and feeding back versions of ourselves that we may or may not recognize. And that may be the most significant change of all. The mirror in architecture and space. One of the more literal legacies of the mirror is its use in urban architecture. Skyscrapers and office buildings became clad in mirrored glass. Reflective surfaces blurred the line between inside and outside. Entire plazas and city streets became echo chambers of light, bouncing images endlessly from pane to pane. This wasn't just aesthetic, it created a sense of visibility and performance. You could see yourself walking down the street. You could be seen from above. A pedestrian in a mirrored city is not only reflected, but also observed. These choices in architecture signaled a deeper cultural truth. Modern life is life in public, even when alone. Mirrors, once private and personal, had been turned outward. And yet, many began to feel more isolated than ever. The mirror as surveillance. In George Orwell's 1984, the mirror appears only once but symbolically. It is everywhere. By the late 20th century, mirrors had a new cousin, the security camera. CCTV systems, two-way mirrors, and reflective domes in grocery stores all borrowed the language of the mirror. They showed what was happening. But unlike mirrors, they didn't reveal the viewer. They only revealed the viewed. This shift marked the evolution of mirrors into tools of surveillance. You can see yourself, but someone else sees you too. And you cannot always see them. This asymmetry altered behavior. Workers perform more diligently under visible cameras. Shoppers act more cautiously near mirrors in stores. Students are quieter in classrooms where mirrors or cameras are mounted. Even mirrored sunglasses became part of this psychological equation, offering opacity, a refusal to reflect emotions or intent. The mirror, once a symbol of self-reflection, had become a symbol of social control. The digital mirror. By the early 2000s, smartphones had introduced a new kind of mirror, one that could reflect not just your face, but your entire life. Organize your memories, conversations, and daily habits. Offer filters, enhancements, and curated versions of yourself to present to others. This was no longer about seeing who you are. It was about deciding who you appear to be. Social media platforms became digital mirrors, allowing people to build identities selective, polished, aspirational. And yet, unlike traditional mirrors, you can't always control what is seen. Others post photos of you. Algorithms analyze your behavior. Corporations track your preferences and moods. The mirror had become two-way, but not always by choice. Now, the line between reflection and manipulation has blurred. We are not just looking at ourselves, we are being shaped by how we are seen. Reflections without glass. In this mirrorless world, some argue that we no longer need physical mirrors. The mirror has become a camera roll, a profile page, a health tracker's graph of heartbeats and steps, a credit score. These are all forms of self-perception. They reflect not the face, but the data of our existence. And this leads to a question. Have we outgrown the mirror, or has the mirror outgrown us? In some modern apartments, mirrors are optional. People use smart displays, phone cameras, and wearable tech to manage their appearance. The bedroom mirror, once central to grooming and identity, now gathers dust. Meanwhile, entire populations spend hours each day tweaking their digital likeness, perfecting avatars, or generating AI-enhanced portraits. These are mirrors, too, but ones that offer fantasy, not honesty. And while the silvered glass showed us what was, these new mirrors show us what we wish to be. The loss of private reflection. But something has been lost. With every advancement in reflection technology, we've gained clarity but lost privacy. The physical mirror, fixed, silent, inert, once offered a private moment, a pause, a way to meet yourself without anyone watching. Now, even when you stare into your phone's front camera, you may not be alone. Your gaze is monitored, your attention sold, your image stored. Reflection has become commerce. Self-awareness has become performance. The mirror once asked, "Who are you?" Now it asks, "Who are you pretending to be?" And so, a tool once associated with wisdom, aging, humility, even vanity, has been co-opted by visibility itself. Where do we go from here? Some speculate we will soon live in homes where every surface is reflective. Smart mirrors in the bathroom that give weather updates. Augmented reality glasses that project our image as we walk. Virtual mirrors in clothing apps that let us try on outfits from home. But others question whether this will bring us closer to ourselves or drive us further into fabricated selves. We might ask, what happens when a mirror tells you what others think of you? What happens when the reflection adjusts itself to please you rather than reflect reality? What happens when mirrors become more flattering than truthful? If the mirror once guided us towards self-knowledge, it now risks becoming a path to delusion. And yet, the mirror remains. Despite all this, the old-fashioned mirror, the one of silver and silence, still holds power. You'll find it in quiet places. The entryway of an old home. The dressing room before a job interview. The hospital bathroom before visiting a sick relative. There, the mirror still offers what it always did, a moment. Not a spectacle, not a brand, not an algorithmic suggestion, just yourself looking back. No enhancement, no feedback, no filter, just you. And in that quiet stare across thousands of years of human history, the question remains, what do you see when no one else is looking? That may be the only reflection that still matters.